Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. On this edition of the pod, we are going back to a great interview with Kerry Gross, who did a limited edition podcast series called Women Who Dare. And it was a great adventure that included a bicycle tour combined with interviews with impressive women all across the country. You know, back when we could travel across the country and do such things. I think it was a really fun time and a really great series that I encourage you to still check out. You can go check it all out at kerrygross.com. And now, Kerry Gross, or at least me introducing Kerry Gross. Kerry Gross, she rates this. Kerry Gross wanted more stories of inspiring women, so she decided to ride her bike from California to Maine in search of women who inspire others. The Women Who Dare podcast tells the story of Kerry's 5,700-mile bike ride and features her interviews with remarkable women. It is that succinct and that perfect and that awesome, and I'm really excited to have Kerry on the show, and I definitely want you all to check out Women Who Dare podcast because it's really good, and it's got a little bit different vibe. It's much more into the storytelling elements of how this ride went, and it's serialized, and it's compelling, and it's cool, and it's an interesting listen, and I think that you should listen to this interview, and then you should immediately go subscribe and download her pod because it's really fun, and I just happened to listen to the most recent episode that was released. I believe it was episode 8, and that was fun. So without further ado, here's Kerry Gross talking about Women Who Dare. I'm here on the Pedalshift Project with Kerry Gross. And Kerry, thanks so much for being on the pod.
Thanks for having me, Tim. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, I'm so stoked to have you here. We talked a little bit in our off mic or off recording about how excited I was about how I listened to your entire run of your podcast to date while I was on a bike overnight, which is, by the way, really a recommended way to do it for anybody who's interested. As I probably talked about in the intro, you are the creator and host of the podcast Women Who Dare, which launched this spring, right? Early March, was it?
Yeah, about a month ago, March 6th.
Okay, gotcha. And I was actually, I have to say, I really enjoyed binging a little bit on it. It's sort of like a good Netflix show that you want to kind of you want to have a few episodes there. If it was just episode 0, I don't know if but having like the first 5 was really great. It's, as you can tell by my gushing, everybody listening, it's a fantastic show. It focuses as much on the bike tour part of it as meeting these amazing women all along the way, which I think is just a really cool bit of synergy that you have going there. I want to kind of back up to sort of the beginning, and you talk about this in episode 0 a little bit, but what got you into bike touring, and how did you arrive at merging a bicycle tour with such a cool interview project?
Yeah, so that's kind of a funny story, actually. I grew up biking a little bit, mountain biking, but not really road biking, not ever thinking that biking across the country was something I was going to do. And then I went to grad school in Indiana, and I started biking a lot more because it was the best way to get outside there. And so I just started biking more, and I was in grad school, and I was feeling sort of unfulfilled and really looking around me and wondering, where are the cool women? Like, I know they're out there, but I don't see them around me, and I really feel like I need these role models to figure out what I want to do with my life. And then sort of coupled that with, I also really want to be biking across the country. But like, knowing myself, I knew that I couldn't bike across the country without some other goal, like some reason that I was biking the next 200 miles to a certain town. And so I figured I should just marry these two interests. Like, I should figure out a way to find women all across the country and interview them, and then make that sort of the goal of my biking across the country. So I spent all last winter asking people for suggestions of women who've inspired them. And then about a year ago now, this is April, I mapped them all out and tried to figure out what routes I could ride across the country to meet them all. And then I took off on my bike and had no idea what was going to happen.
And that's kind of the charm of the whole thing too, wasn't it? That this was as much as an adventure as it was connecting with these cool, powerful women that are doing cool, powerful things. So when you were looking at the map, what was sort of, were you sort of stuck on, oh God, where do I start? Or was it pretty obvious when you had it all there?
It was pretty obvious. I had ended up on the West Coast for the winter, so I knew that I was going to be biking west to east. And then from everything I'd ever read about riding the Pacific coast, up Route 1, I knew that I just had to ride that. And fortunately, there were lots of people up in the Pacific Northwest who were recommended. And so it just made total natural sense to ride from San Francisco up the coast to Seattle just to start out the trip.
Yeah, and the one thing about riding the Pacific Coast, as you discovered, going northbound is a little bit, how do I want to put it? I want to say lonely because you meet a lot of people. It's just they're all going the opposite direction. Talk a little bit about what your experience was being a northbound rider, something I have, by the way, never done except under duress to go back to get something like a lost item.
This is sort of like where my bike touring naiveness comes in. And I had no idea, didn't even think about prevailing winds or anything. And was just like, well, I need to ride from San Francisco to Seattle. Here's a road. Here's a tour. And I didn't actually realize until I was maybe halfway up the coast, one of my warm showers hosts was really kind and was like, you're doing this the way 10% of people do. Keep going, you'll make it. And so it was sort of lonely, but it was also springtime, so no one was really riding it yet. It was a little bit early anyway. But I will say that April is a great time to ride it because of the winds. There's that fogginess that sometimes happens on the coast actually doesn't happen because the winds blow it out of the way. So even though I'm grinding into this headwind, I have beautiful views the whole time, which is cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's pluses and minuses to doing it during the different seasons. I was the fool who decided to do a piece of the Washington coast a few weeks ago in the rain and everything, but I caught some cool magical days. So sometimes it makes you appreciate the good weather a little bit more. And I think there was at least one day in the pod where you talked about that, where, you had a tailwind, I think, for the first time. And I just think it's I've been there. I know that. And I think a lot of your listeners who've done touring know that too. I want to talk ask you a little bit about one of the things you brought up in the first few episodes, and that's pulling together your gear on a budget. What was the process like? And do you think you made the right choices, maybe other than that tent, which sounded like that was a little bit of a struggle?
The tent is a little bit of a struggle. The tent was a hand-me-down from my mom who'd done some bike touring, and legitimately, I affectionately call it my blue coffin. It's about knee-high. There's no sitting up in it. But yeah, the pulling together a touring gear on a budget, basically what I did was map out, these are the most important things, that being a bike and waterproof panniers, and so allocate my budget based on the most essential things, which I think was actually perfect because it means that my bike didn't get heavy with anything that was well, maybe I won't need it. If it could go in the question mark column, I was not buying it. And I also did things I made my own stove, I made a soda can stove. And so I think the pressure of a budget, it probably cost me $2,000 to outfit the whole system, starting from scratch. But I think that the ingenuity of trying to build things was an added, I kind of enjoyed it.
I'm curious about the stove because I've tinkered with making stoves a lot. And I have a couple of really jacked up, cat food, tin stoves and stuff like that. Were you like a YouTube person like I am and just going, oh, how do you do this? Or Instructables? Did you, or did you know how to do this innately? How did you go about the process with that?
No, I just used Google, and a friend of mine who bike toured had made a soda can stove before. And so I was like, well, I know this is a thing I can do. And then I read sort of reviews on a couple of different designs and was just like, well, I'll try this out. And if I hate it, there are grocery stores. I don't have to cook food.
Did you find that to be the case? I for me, when I'm on a longer tour, it's I'm super, I'm going to make this great dinner every night. And then by about week 2 or 3, I'm going to get a bag of chips and a brick of cheese. And that's about it. Did you find that to be the case for you as well?
Absolutely. And especially when I started out, end of April, it's still pretty chilly. And it was windy. And the last thing I wanted to do in camp was 2 sets of camp chores. I pretty much have energy to do 1 set of camp chores, and that is setting up my tent. And then the cooking, you're well, I could just eat a wrap. It'd be fine.
I get so lazy. Like I try to be healthy sometimes, but like if there's a grocery store in town, I'll get like a whole bag of salad and I will literally like put all the contents in the bag and shake it up and just eat out of that bag. That is how desperate I get at times. So I totally get it.
Yeah, totally. And I find myself when I get to a grocery store, like some tours, and I really applaud people who can do this, like manage to find a nice, cute park to eat in. I pretty much just like buy my food at the grocery store and then sit out front next to my bike and eat it.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I almost want to say, like, if you're going to have a bike rack, might as well just throw a picnic table for us, too, if you're on any kind of major route. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Safeway, if you're listening. Hey, tell me about your mom. You said that she did some touring back in the day. What was her experience like? And did her stories, did that sort of plant a seed for you for all of your adventures?
Yeah, I think, my mom gets up every morning and runs, and she's just someone who's always tried to get outside. And so that sort of inspired me in general. But then when she was in college, she went to school in Massachusetts and was working on schooners up in Maine, and she didn't have a car. And so she was like, well, I have a bike, so I might as well just bike there. And so she would do every spring and fall, she would do a 2 or 3 day tour from Boston up to Maine and back. And then her brother also has done a bunch of touring. And so just the combination of the two of them talking about stories that they've done and just made me realize that it's possible to bike tour,
Yeah, absolutely. What were some of the routes that she did? And when was this? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it was the 70s. And so I actually have no idea what routes she rode, but I imagine she rode Route 1 up the coast of Maine more than once. And then her brother did a bunch of touring up in Nova Scotia when he was in high school. So that would have put him in the late 60s. And his stories, when he talks about it, is like knocking on the door of farmers' houses and saying, hey, do you mind if I camp in your yard for a little bit? And when he talks about it, he's like, at worst, you got somewhere to camp. And at best, you got a hot meal and a hot shower. And I think that sort of generosity, I mean, it's wonderful to hear that was a thing in the 60s, because I think that sort of generosity is what I found all the way across the country, too.
Yeah, that's what I hear a lot. And I'm glad that we connected these two things, because I find when you talk about how you find a place to sleep at night in the pod, that you are a much more adventurous person than planny Virgo guy like me, who just needs to know, all right, today I'm going to go 60 miles and I'm going to end up at this campsite. But it sounds like that you had examples in your family's life about, kind of doing this a little more seat of the pants style. What was sort of your process for, as the day wound down, to find a place to sleep? Was it as simple as, hey, there's a barn, I'm going to go check out that dude's property? Or how was that for you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So at the end of the day, if I could, I would try to like end up at a grocery store, fill up on water, fill up on food, somewhere around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, depending on sunlight. And then I would just tell myself, like once for me at least, once I decide that it's time to start looking for a campsite, like you have to take the first one you get, because you have no idea how long it's going to take. And so I would just ride a little bit slower and just with my head up, looking at spots of trees or fields, or looking at the map to see if I'm going through any forest land or anything. I didn't actually, my uncle is really confident in knocking on farmers' doors. And I think that this is the one difference between him being a guy and me being a woman, is that I'm not super comfortable knocking on strangers' doors. So I just found like public lands or semi-public lands or lands that didn't have no trespassing signs on them, that I felt pretty confident that no one would find me for the 14 hours that I'm going to spend there.
Yeah, one of the examples when you were having a really rough time was in the Redwoods area. And as you were describing going through, I know which town you were talking about. That was super sketchy, by the way. I'm exactly the same way. But as you were getting towards the Avenue of the Giants, I'm like, oh my God, there's a campground. There is the greatest campground in all of bicycle touring that is so close. And then you ended up kind of off the road. And I was like, no, you're close to this great one. But you probably were so beat because you had come up and over, I think, Leggett Hill that day. That's a heck of a ride. So first of all, hats off to you. But how does it feel when you're in that scenario? Is that why you sort of have your system that you just described? It's like 3, 4 o'clock. I grab the first one that looks good.
Totally, because you have no idea. And I wish there was some better way. I don't know if you've heard of freecampsites.net. I've used that a lot too, where people have put in like free open public lands or like places that no one's minded if other people have camped. And I wish there was a similar database for bike tourers, or like a just go 10 more miles, like you'll make it. Because I don't know if you feel this, but sometimes at the end of the day, I'm tired and hungry. My brain just stops working and I like get to like desperation mode. And I'm like, well, this'll do. This'll be fine. And more often than not, I'm pretty happy with where I ended up. There are a few occasions where I'm like biking the next morning and I'm like, oh man, like 200 yards further down the road was a way better spot.
Dude, that's the worst. I have totally been there. Since I'm a little more on the like, planny kind of side of things, I do like a short, medium, and long day kind of setup. And there are times when I've chosen one of them and then I end up biking past the one that would have been not that much longer. And it's so much better. And you're just like, oh, that just sucks. In Newport, I know this. And I tell people this when I go through Newport, Oregon, that if you're going southbound, which you probably should, although you could be badass like you and go northbound, but for the rest of us, 90%, right?
Go southbound.
Yeah, go southbound. There's the place where all of the books and guides have you stay is a great campsite. But if you just go through the city of Newport and go to the next one down, it is a notch better. It has all the same amenities, and you can ride your bike unloaded after you've got all your gear down to Rogue's Brewers on the Bay and go grab a few beers and then bike back. It is a magical place. So yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I want to pivot off because I want to talk a little bit more about the project side of things, because to me, the thing that makes this podcast more than just a bike touring podcast is learning more about all of these really cool, powerful women that you've got to meet all around the country. I'm curious, you already talked about sort of how you found the women that you interviewed, but I'm curious about how they responded to you when you reached out to them. Did you encounter any resistance to the project because you were on a bike, or did you find that opened up doors for you?
I think that actually opened up doors for me. And it's funny, like even I was 3/4 of the way across the country and I was still nervous every email I was sending, being like, maybe this is the one they're going to say no. And no one said no to me across the country. And I think it was really helpful for me, maybe like a week ahead of when I wanted to interview someone, I would send an email and say, hey, I'm going to be here, but in this 2-day stretch, do you have any time to give me? And I think that making it that finite and saying, hey, I'm biking across the country, this is where I'm going to be, I'd love to meet you, really opened up doors. And people were like, well, you're doing a cool thing. I'd love to share about the cool things I'm doing with you.
Of the interviews that you've got up right now, which one would you recommend to a new listener? Which was sort of, I mean, I don't want you to play too much on the favorite side, but like because I really enjoyed them all. They were all really different, but which one of all of them would you say is a good entry point for someone who wants to listen to your show and understand the project?
I think that the one that I recorded with Carol Hossey would be really interesting for a lot of your listeners, because it's someone who was a traveler, really explored the whole country and the world before settling down into a place and finding something. And I think that spirit of like, she thought she was going to do something to start out with, ended up traveling a ton, and then figuring out the rest of her life. And so I think that spirit of Carol Hossey is really a door opener, like be a great first listen.
Yeah, I think that was my favorite one too. I'm glad you said that one.
Yeah.
As of the time of this interview, we're at the end of leg 1 in your pod. I'm going to ask, maybe you can give us a preview of leg 2. What does it look like? And also I'm curious, how do you see, because all of these things, this is all in the past. This isn't a tour that you're doing right now. How do you view the release schedule for the show going forward?
Leg 2, just to start out with, takes me from Whitefish, Montana. So the way that the route worked is that I biked 5 1,000-mile routes and connected them with Amtrak. And so I woke up, after taking an all-night train from Seattle to Whitefish, and then I bike for 20 or 30 days from there down to Denver. And so this leg is really about a transition from the Pacific coast, where it's coastal and there are pine trees and it's really lush and green, to the like wide open landscape and mountain passes that I find in Montana and Wyoming. And so it's got a totally like different vibe, which I think is really fun and hard. But then as for the release schedule, basically the way I've tried to make it work is that it's about a week or 10 days of riding that's in an episode, and it usually has at least one or two interviews that goes along with it. So when listeners get to listen, they can say, oh, this is where she was in the trip, and here are a couple of interviews. And so that gives people who are maybe like not that interested in a particular interview a way to keep following along with the trip, or you could just listen to all the interviews if you're more interested in that.
Yeah, that's what I thought was really cool about it, was that you have these nice interstitials, which is sort of like it binds the touring piece together. So if you're looking for this to be, first of all, I would say I like this as a unit. It makes sense. It's tied together. But if you're more interested in the interviews, you can listen to just the interviews and have this really powerful, awesome podcast about women who rock. Or if you want just a bike touring podcast, there's an awesome bike touring podcast. But I really do think that they go together really well. So I'm excited to see to hear what Leg 2 has to offer. I want to backtrack just a touch before we sort of wrap things up. Talk about your Amtrak experience, because I've talked about it on my podcast before that, it's getting progressively better and better, but there's always places for Amtrak to screw things up. And I'm just curious, where did you have a good experience overall? And I don't want to spoil, of course, any episodes that are potentially upcoming, but what was your experience like, and how do you think that they catered to you as a bike tourist?
I think that the combination of bike touring and Amtrak travel is actually perfect. Because what Amtrak gets dinged on is like sometimes it doesn't show up quite on time. It doesn't work really well for people who are holding to a tight schedule. And that's where I think it sort of works well with bike touring. Honestly, it doesn't matter to me if the train arrives 2 hours late in Whitefish, Montana, right? Like, doesn't totally mess up my ride schedule. And it was perfect. I mean, the ability to just walk my bike up to the baggage car and just be done with it, not have to box it, not have to worry about whether it's going to be there because it's going to be there on the same train that I am, I really liked it. I learned a few things along the way, like don't give up your sleeping bag, bring it onto the train with you. But overall, it was a good experience, I think.
Especially now that they're starting to expand the roll-on service to most of their long-haul lines, it's such a big difference. And I'm about to do a big ride where I'm taking Amtrak out to Missouri from DC and doing the Katy Trail across and then taking Amtrak back. So this will be like sleeper car style and all that other kind of stuff. So I'm kind of stoked for all that. But I use it all the time on the C&O here in DC because I can get up trail a lot and then come back, or vice versa, depending on how I want to go. So I'm with you. I'm a big fan of how Amtrak works. In the bicycle touring setup, it just works really well. So, Kerry, you are at kerrygross.com. You've got the Women Who Dare podcast on all your favorite podcast apps. You've got Facebook, you've got Insta. Anything else that you'd love to share with the listeners of the Pedalshift Project about your podcast, about your tour, or things along those lines?
No, I think we've covered most of it. I'm just really excited for people to listen to it and to share it with other people. I think my goal for this project was to inspire other people to do awesome things. And so if you listen to it and you find like, oh, I'm really psyched about this, or I'm really inspired to do this, like shoot me an email and spread it to anyone else. I think that just like inspiring other people to ride bikes or just to do something maybe that scares them. It's really exciting for me.
Like I said, I really dig it. And folks on this show know that I'm super picky about my pods and about like who I say, hey, this is a really good podcast. So I feel like I hope I haven't led anybody astray in any of the podcasts I've recommended, but this is one of them, everyone. So go subscribe, go to Kerry's website, go subscribe on all your podcatchers, your phones, and in all those other types of things that you use to get your favorite podcast episodes. So Kerry, thank you for being on the Pedalshift Project.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift Project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono. wherever cool music is available.